Hello, my name is Professor Jana Rošker, and I'm teaching and researching sinology, more concretely Chinese philosophy, at the Department for Asian Studies at the University of Ljubljana. I'm very glad and honored to be speaking today here, albeit only online, but that's better than nothing. And I'm glad to be able to share with you some of my thoughts on Zehou and modern Confucianism. I will talk about the comparison between Zehou's philosophy and the philosophy of modern Confucianism, which is an intellectual stream of thought that was dealing with the Confucian revival and that came into life in the beginning of the previous century. And for those of you who don't know Zehou, I will shortly introduce him as well. He belongs to the most important and influential contemporary Chinese philosophers. His thought could be described as the search for a synthesis between Western and traditional Chinese thought in order to elaborate a system of ideas and values capable of resolving the social and political problems of the modern globalized world. In most of his works, Li attempted to reconcile Western, especially Kantian and Marxist, theories with traditional Chinese, especially Confucian, but also Taoist ideas, concepts, and values. Well, he wanted somehow to create a theoretical model of modernization that would not be confused or equated with Westernization. A similar agenda is typical for the modern Confucian stream of thought. However, the approaches taken by this intellectual current on the one side and Li's philosophy on the other side differ in many aspects. Before providing a comparative analysis of this current, of these two currents or of these two philosophies, let me first shortly introduce their respective theories. So, Zehou's mature philosophical thought was elaborated during the last 2 decades of the 20th century, and it was contemporary with an intense revival of Confucian thought in China. But this revival, again, and its most influential approaches differ in many ways from the theories of the so-called new or modern new Confucian stream of thought, Xiandai Xin Ru Xue. Although Zehou's philosophy is clearly influenced by these approaches, he was critical of this stream of thought. In fact, he stated, as we can see for those of you who can read Chinese, as we can see in this quotation, he says in this quotation that while he could identify with Confucianism, he could identify with being a Confucianist, but he could never accept modern new Confucianism, which he saw as a continuation and modernization of the Neo-Confucian school of the structural principle or structural pattern, a discourse which he rejected without appeal. But now, if we examine his views more closely, it becomes evident that his criticisms of this stream of thought were directed primarily at its presumed inability to produce a truly systematic philosophy. He certainly believed that its contributions to the preservation and modernization of Chinese tradition were of utmost importance. So we can see here in this quotation on this slide that he says, apart from the Sinicization of Marxism, Leninism, the only stream of thought in contemporary Chinese intellectual and philosophical history that has provided a creative link to the Chinese tradition is the current of modern Confucianism. So it was, in a sense, a kind of a love-hate relationship But despite these similarities and points of agreement, many significant differences exist between Zehou and the stream of modern Confucian thought. As already mentioned, the question of a revival of Chinese intellectual tradition and the possibilities to upgrade it with new theories that could meet the requirements of a specifically Chinese type of modernization was in the forefront of both philosophies, the modern Confucian philosophy as well as Zehou's philosophy. Proceeding from the respective views of the modernization process, which was, as we have seen, in the center of their theoretical endeavors, we will examine differences between Li and the modern Confucians on the basis of analyzing 4 aspects. These 4 aspects are the problem of the history of Confucian philosophy. We will take a look how these 2 streams of thought, these 2 philosophies have looked upon the history of Confucian philosophy. Then the second is the question of ontology, especially in respect to the questions of immanence and transcendence. Then the third aspect through which will serve us as a lens of viewing similarities and differences in these 2 streams of thought will be the question or the problem of the human self. And the last but not least one is the problem of the relation between individuals and society. How do they look to this relationship? Well, let us begin the comparative investigation of these 3 aspects with a short introduction of modern Confucian views on these questions. And before that, let us take a brief general look upon this stream of thought. Who are modern Confucians? Who are the members of this intellectual stream of thought? Well, first I would like to begin with the name. The original Chinese name of this current is Xin Ruxue, which literally means New Confucianism. However, I prefer to denote it with the term modern Confucianism or modern New Confucianism, Xianda Xin Ruxue, because some scholars, especially the ones who are not too familiar with the history of Confucian thought, also, and in the Western reception, also translate it as Neo-Confucianism. Of course, Xin Ruxue means New Confucianism, and it can also be denoted as Neo-Confucianism in this literary sense. But when they say Neo-Confucianism to this current, they create a confusion with the theories of the second reform of Confucianism from the Sung and Ming dynasties, which was also denoted as Neo-Confucianism by the first translators into Western languages, who were mostly missionaries. Although the actual name of the school was Li Xue, and then in Ming Dynasty, the ideal stream Xin Xue, which means the school of structural pattern or the school of heart mind. But they somehow, these missionaries have seen that it was a reform of the Confucian thought, so they have denoted it as Neo-Confucianism. And then this name has stuck and remained widely used in Western sinological scholarship. This is the main reason because of which I prefer to use the term modern Confucianism. And another reason because of which I find it better to use that term is also the fact that the members of this stream of thought had, as already mentioned, dealt with diverse questions linked to the modernization of classical Confucian thought. So the name modern Confucianism is quite suitable. So modern Confucianism is distinguished by a, no, this was too quick, is distinguished by a multifaceted attempt to revitalize traditional thought by means of new influences borrowed or derived from Western systems. It defines itself with a search for a synthesis between Western and traditional Chinese thought, aiming to elaborate a new system of ideas and values suitable for the modern globalized Chinese societies. So the contemporary intellectual history mainly orders them into three generations, and this genealogy, which distinguished schools members according to the generations, is part of the Confucian historiography anyway. So the first generation of modern Confucianism has lived and worked in the beginning of the 20th century for the first 3 decades, because after that all these wars started. First the Japanese, anti-Japanese war, then the Second World War, then the Civil War. So this, as I said, these philosophers have lived and worked in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, and there were Liang Shuming, Xiong Shili, Zhang Junmai, Feng Youlan, and He Lin. Well, maybe the most important among them for the further development of modern Confucian thought was Xiong Shili, because he was the teacher of almost all members of the second generation. The second generation has lived and worked in the second half of the 20th century, mainly in Taiwan and Hong Kong. And well, there are some different categorizations, but I think that the most important members of this second generation were Fang Dongmei, Tang Junyi, Xu Fuguan, and Mou Zhongshan, especially Tang Junyi and Mou Zhongshan. And the third generation consists of philosophers who are still active, with the exception of Liu Shuxian, the second one, the second from the left, who sadly passed away a few years ago. I think it was 2016. But all the others are still active. They still live and do research and write, but they live in. They don't live in China or in any Sinophone country. They live mostly in the USA. And these are Cheng Zhongying, Tu Weiming, and Yu Yingshi. Liu Shuxian, who also belonged to this generation, has passed away already, as I already mentioned. But following the period of gradual liberalization, numerous brilliant new Confucian scholars appeared in the People's Republic of China also, and they focused on many previously neglected or overlooked aspects of the original Confucian thought, while also developing new approaches for its modernized integration into contemporary Chinese society. And these scholars include important figures such as Guo Zhiyong, Chen Lai, Zheng Jiadong, Zhang Liwen, Meng Peiyuan, Mou Zhongjian. They are all still active, with the exception of the important scholar Tang Yijie, who has also sadly passed away in 2014. But due to the time limitations, I will first limit my presentation to the work of the most important members of the so-called second generation of modern Confucianism, because it is hitherto till today the most influential one, and also because Li Zehou's criticism, we are doing here Li Zehou and modern Confucianism, also because Li Zehou's criticism of this intellectual current has mainly been focused upon these 4 scholars. This second generation was represented by Mou Zhongshan, Fang Dongmei, Tang Junyi, and Xu Fuguan. So in the second half of the 20th century, these philosophers have been living and working in Taiwan and Hong Kong, respectively. And due to time limitations, I will try to summarize the essence of their respective individual findings and to delineate their ontological foundations, by which they aimed to provide a philosophical basis for a new mode of specifically Chinese or Confucian modernization. And I will approach their philosophies through the lens of the four aforementioned aspects, namely the history of Confucian thought, ontology, human, self, and the relation between individual and societies. So these four approaches were applied in their endeavors to synthesize the process of modernization, which belonged, as already mentioned, to their main agenda. They have mainly followed the presumption according to which China's modernization did not represent a natural process that could be defined solely by the inherent dynamics of an autochthonous social development. Although modern Confucians believed that the European colonial past has to a great extent influenced these processes, so the modernization, in fact, as it happens, did not grow naturally in China, but was somehow imported from the West as a side product of the European colonialization. So, although it was to a great extent influenced by the West, it could, in the view of modern Confucians, not been equated with Westernization. Although modernization came to China from the West, it cannot be equated with Westernization. So for them, modernization was not necessarily a universal process, but rather one that was also, at least partly, culturally conditioned. So they have striven to develop a renovation of traditional Chinese, especially Confucian thought, in order to become able to preserve Chinese cultural identity in the modern world. So let us first take a look to the modern Confucian view on the history of Confucian thought. This history can be, in their view, divided to three phases. The first one is original Confucianism, which flourished between the 5th and the 3rd century before Christ, and it was its main representatives were, in the eyes of modern Confucianism, Confucius and Mencius only. Yeah, they have left out an important philosopher in Zehou's view, but also in my view, namely Xunzi, but we will talk about that later. So the second phase for the modern Confucians was the Neo-Confucian reform, which happened in the Song dynasty, but also in the Ming dynasty. There were many important Neo-Confucian philosophers. So that was in the time between the 10th and the 3rd, or even the 15th century. And their main representatives were Zhu and Wang Yangming. And then the third phase was modern Confucianism, in which the Confucian scholars tried to revive classical Confucianism through a dialogue with Western philosophies. And this was their own stream of thought, and as already mentioned, it came to life by the end of the 19th and in the beginning of the 20th century. So let's proceed to the second aspect, which will serve as a lens of comparison. Let's take a look how the modern Confucian philosophers have looked upon the questions of ontology. They saw it as the philosophical discipline that would provide clear solutions to the problems they faced, beginning with that of Western modernization, and with the conviction that only through a genuine and a clear comprehension of the cosmic order and its relation to human existence would modern man be able to find his or her spiritual home again. But of course, ontology as a specific philosophic discipline didn't exist in traditional China or in classical Confucianism, because traditional Chinese philosophy didn't apply any concepts like being or existence. And even the Chinese language does not provide any means to express this, has not provided any means to express these terms. So the ontology as a philosophic discipline has been introduced by Western systems of thought, and a synthesis of Chinese and Western ideas in the field of questions linked to the realm of existence and of being was therefore crucial to the establishment of a new value system compatible with current social conditions and the preservation of an integral cultural and personal identity. However, the focus upon ontological questions can also be seen as a specific reaction of traditional Chinese philosophy to modernization. It represents a specific attempt of constructive reactions to developmental trends of theoretical and also practical, actually, problems of modernization with the help of certain elementary aspects of traditional Chinese philosophy. So let's take a look. According to modern Confucian interpretations, the concept of heaven or nature, Tian, was the ultimate noumenon in the Confucian thought, the ultimate substance, the origin of all existence. It was transcendent, which means that it superseded the realm of what we people can see, touch, or perceive through our limited sense organs. And it represented the elementary entity creating and changing everything that exists. In their view, the Confucian comprehension of being arose from this concept. So Mao Zedong, one of the main proponents of the second generation of modern Confucianism, wrote, as we can see in this slide, which concept can lead us to break through existence? It is the concept of nature, or of heaven, of Tian. So this heaven was transcendent, as we have seen. But the Confucian heaven was also immanent, since it it endowed human beings with nature, Xing, that was essentially determined by the elementary Confucian virtue of humanism, which means that the heaven was somehow permeated with values also, with goodness. So the cosmos, in essence, for them is good, and this goodness also reflects in the inwardness of human beings, which have, of course, to develop this germs of goodness. So here we have a specific connection between ontology and ethics, and this specific connections has been conditioned by the fundamental Confucian worldview of the so-called immanent transcendence, 内在超越. Now I shall briefly introduce this worldview, provide a short analysis of its contrast with the ontological views that have prevailed in the Western intellectual history, and illuminate its inherent structural connection between the realms of ontology, epistemology, and ethics. So what is actually this this immanent transcendence? What is 内在超越? Li Minghui, contemporary Taiwanese Confucian scholar, has defined it in the following way. While interpreting traditional Confucian thought, the modern Confucians have often made use of the ideas of transcendence or immanence. They pointed out that the Confucian heaven, Tao, or its elementary spirit, was simultaneously transcendent and immanent, which is in diametrical opposition with the basic model of Western religions, which are simultaneously transcendent and external. However, this notion has met a lot of criticism by many Western-trained philosophers, because in Western philosophy, the spheres of immanence and transcendence normally exclude each other. So it is a paradox in itself if we speak of immanent transcendence. Something is either immanent or it is transcendent. So it is very difficult to understand this holistic vision of a double ontology. So many Western-trained philosophers see the notion of immanent transcendence, or transcendence in immanence is maybe a better translation of 内在超越, as a paradox in itself. But modern Confucians tried over and over to explain this concept also with some other notions from classical Chinese philosophy. For instance, Tao, they said the Tao, which belongs to the central concept of traditional Chinese philosophy, and which manifests itself in many different ways in the category of the so-called way, is also such a notion of immanent transcendence. Because in its oneness and indivisibility, it reflects the original cosmic principle. But on the other hand, it also reflects the smallest atomic parts of existence, continuously creating through their infinite combinations all existing worlds. So Tao is the elementary abstract driving force of the universe, and simultaneously, it is the concrete intimate pet of every human being. Because Tao is the fundamental source of all existence, and simultaneously, it is the incorporation of each particular appearance. So Liu Shuxian, for instance, a member of the third generation, defined it in the following way, defined this difference in the following way. He said, the theological worldview of Christian religion could be defined as pure transcendence. This means that God has created the world, but it is not part of it. Thus, God possesses such transcendental nature and is beyond or outside of the world. This is the actual traditional faith in the Christian tradition. On the one, but Tao is something completely different. On the one hand, Tao is above the forms, which means that it is metaphysical, and thus not a definite, visible, or perceivable thing. Therefore, it is transcendent. On the other, it can only be put into practice through definite things. So therefore, it is immanent. This is the form of the immanent transcendence. So Tao, or all the other ideas of immanent transcendence, they are also by no means absolute principles, because their nature is conditioned also by everything that they surpass. So they have a double ontological nature. The concepts resulting from the immanent worldview are based upon the relativization of everything that exists. Therefore, they seldom appear independently and individually. In the tradition of Chinese philosophy, this essential relativity has been expressed through binary categories, which are duilik fanchong in Chinese, which are a very important tool, epistemological tool in Chinese philosophy. They're composed of binary oppositions. For instance, yin-yang is such a binary category which is very well known, even outside of the sinological or Chinese circles. Then banmo, the root and the branches, which we could also say it is relation between the universalism and particularism, or universal and particular. Ti yung, the substance or the essence and function, which is also which we will talk about this last binary category, essence and function, a little bit more in detail a bit later. So the complementary mutual interaction of both antipodes is able to express even the most complex section of time and space. So how do these binary categories function? Actually, binary categories are, of course, composed of the two oppositional notions. And so this binary pattern of thought is actually nothing that could be specifically Chinese, because thinking in contrast belongs to the most elementary modes of or patterns of human thought in general. So we can find binary oppositions in any culture or in any philosophy. But the concrete mode of these interactions between these two oppositional notions can, of course, differ to a great extent. So the modern European philosophy has developed the model of Cartesian dualism, which is also based on binary oppositions. But in this model, the two oppositional notions, for instance, mind and matter, or mind and body, or idea and matter, are not only in mutual opposition, but also at the same time in mutual contradiction, because they exclude each other. So, but the Chinese binary categories like yin and yang, they are based on a non-contradictory opposition between the two poles, because these two poles don't exclude each other, but rather complement each other. So they are guided by a principle of correlative complementarity. They are interdependent and they complete one another. So, but now let's proceed from ontology to the second aspect we have mentioned before, namely, and take a look. We should take a look upon upon the question of the human self. How have modern Confucian philosophers seen the human beings? And we will introduce this question through the lens of all four members of modern Confucianism. But first, let's say what they have in common. These modern Confucian philosophers have seen the human being as a being which is also transcendent and immanent at the same time. Human beings are finite, that we are confined to our sense organs, in our understanding, but on the other hand, we are also infinite. So we live in a concrete physical world on the one side, but our inwardness, namely our heart mind, also possesses transcendent potentials. I will now show how this potential was theoretized by each of the four members of the second generation. So the first one is Fang Dongmei. There is another thing I want to expose before going to Fang Dongmei, and which is also general for all the modern Confucian philosophers. This view of human beings has been developed in China during the so-called axial age, which lasted from 800 to 200 BC, and it is a notion which was developed by Karl Jaspers, who said that in this period of time, all the great civilization on the earth have proceeded from the primitive natural religions to the more developed, mostly monotheistic religions. And the reason was, of course, the development of the means of production or the development of technology. Because with the increasing technology, the old natural deities became unreliable. Nobody could believe into them. But while in most of the other regions or cultures or civilizations, these natural deities, natural religions were replaced by a higher stage of more complex religions, monotheistic religions. In China, the religion was eliminated in this process during the Zhou dynasty, and it was transformed into morality and transformed into something that is a part of human inwardness, of our human mind. The representatives of the second generation have namely followed the supposition according to which the above-mentioned historical process of social transformations in China, namely the idea of heaven or nature, which we have mentioned before, has been transformed from an almost anthropomorphic higher force to criteria of inherent or of inner human morality. And Fang Dongmei, as we can see for those of you who can read Chinese from this quotation, has explained at first this culture was formed on the basis of a religious spirit, but it has been transformed into a culture of highly developed ethics. This ethics was assumed and properly ordered by Confucius. That's why Confucianism is relevant and also in classical Chinese culture. So Xu Fuguan, the second member of this stream of thought, has followed this hypothesis, and he exposed that this happened because the faith into these natural deities has vanished because of the advanced technology, and it resulted not in a new, more complex religion, but in something he has called Youhuan Yishi, concerned consciousness. It was an idea of a social responsibility and righteousness, which was supposed to serve as a fundamental criteria and thus replace the previous fear of spirits. Xu has emphasized that this transformation represented a higher level of spiritual development than the human moral evolvement offered by monotheistic religions, which are based upon the idea of an external God. According to him, according to Xu Fuguan, in China, this transformation has led humanism based upon a high level of this transformation has led to humanism, and this humanism was based on an idea or on a high level of self-awareness. So this self-awareness, who am I? How can I live? How can I take care for my life and the life of my fellow human beings and so on? So this self-awareness suggestion was a very important element in the establishment of this inner morality. Xu Fuguan wrote, the main contribution of the Zhou period lies in the fact that the spirit of self-awareness was incorporated into traditional religious life. In this sense, a culture that has previously been rooted in material achievements was raised to the sphere of ideas. This contributed to the establishment of the humanistic spirit of Chinese morality. Let's take a look to what Mo Zhongshan has to say. So regarding the human beings, Mo Zhongshan is doubtless the most famous and also the best philosopher of the modern Confucian intellectual current. And since human beings exist in the sphere of immanent transcendence, he exposed that they're finite and at the same time also infinite. On this basis, he has developed a double ontology, namely an ontology of the noumenal and the ontology of the phenomenal world. These were two ontologies, but which were also connected. So it was a double ontology. And Mo Zhongshan writes, if we presuppose that humans are finite, but can also at the same time be infinite, we need an ontology of two levels. The first one is the ontology of the noumenal sphere, things as such, and can also be called the ontology of the intangibleness. The second one is the ontology of the phenomenal sphere and can also be named ontology of tangibleness. Tang Junyi exposed then that the link that connects immanent and the transcendental sphere, or the two parts of the human being, the tangible, the untangible, the immanent, the transcendent, the finite and the infinite one, is simultaneously also the link connecting the individual with the society in which he or she lives. Tang Junyi's idea of such individual self, such individual self-awareness is rooted in the individual feeling of the inborn responsibility that could lead humans to the opaque jungle of all ethical dilemmas and the doubts with which they are confronted in their concrete lives. This social responsibility can be seen also in this quotation, in which Tang Junyi exposes the importance of human dignity. He writes, a human being is not a thing, a human being is a goal in his or herself. This means that individuals are not tools of the society and neither of the state. And the people of today are not tools for the people of tomorrow. But if we say that people are not tools of society, this does not mean that we are outside of it. And individuals should neither look upon society and state as upon a tool for the achievement of their own egoistic interests. However, human mind and humanness consist of mutuality and love. If an individual strives to actually and fully act out this inborn consciousness, he or she will by no means feel divided from the society. I believe that the conflict between individuals and society can only be solved through educating people in the utmost possible development of their inborn moral nature. The binary category of individual and community which is also an opposition, can only be solved through educating people, can only be developed through educating people in the utmost possible development of their inborn moral nature. The binary category of individual and community can only be transcended in this way. In this way, the existence of society will truly benefit the existence of individuals, and individual minds will truly benefit the existence of society. So as we have seen, education is also here a very important factor which enables human beings to cultivate these germs of goodness that are inherently in their heart minds. This is a mention, this is an element of the philosopher Mencius. So as we could see, the modern Confucian philosophers see the world as a metaphysical reality which is immanent to everything that exists in the universe and which also possesses transcendent moral quality. So in this view, as we have seen, the whole cosmos, the whole existence is permitted with values. This means, and we can only comprehend, we can only understand this existence, this cosmos, with true axiology, through understanding ourselves and the values that matter in our life as a human being embedded into a society. This means that ontology, epistemology, and axiology are tightly connected in this worldview. But on the other hand, what is also very important, every human being is a relational being. A human being is innately and inherently moral. For every human heart, mind includes humanness. But this basic Confucian virtue, Ren, which we can see in this left side of the slide, is also a virtue of reciprocal and mutual empathy. In Chinese society, it can function in this mutual reciprocal way because the Confucian ethics is relational. And every human self, every individual also can only exist if he or she is embedded in a social context through his or her relations to other fellow people. So this relational ethics was emphasized by all modern Confucian philosophers, and this relational ethics is based upon the notion of a relational self. In such a framework, as I already mentioned, no individual is seen as an isolated being separated from society and community. Proceeding from alienation, which defines modern post-capitalist societies in the global world, it is therefore of utmost importance to analyze the question whether such a modern Confucian model of onto-epistemological ethics is therefore on its way to generate a non-individualistic version of modernity. Because if so, then the previously inevitable or inherent relation between modernity and individualism would have proven itself to be nothing more than an outcome of specific, namely Western historical circumstances. So I think that this modern Confucian approach to a non-individualism-based ethics is of utmost importance. So much for this basic introduction of modern Confucian philosophy, and now let's take a look upon Zehou's philosophy. So we will also proceed in this respect, the problems linked to the intellectual basis of Chinese modernization. As already mentioned, Li Zehou's thought could likewise be described as the search for a synthesis between Western and traditional Chinese thought, and also similar to the members of modern Confucianism, he also aimed to elaborate a system of ideas and values based upon the Chinese, particularly Confucian tradition, and capable of resolving the social and political problems of the modern globalized world. As we shall see, Li also rejects the complete Westernization, and he also aims to achieve an ideational basis that could preserve Chinese cultural identity in the modern era. Now, let us take a brief look upon Li Zehou's philosophy. In this respect, we will also proceed from the problems of modernization. With respect to the central issue that defined modern Chinese philosophical discourses, namely what position to assume vis-a-vis Western thought, there was a famous slogan. Some of you will probably know it. It was created, or it is known as Zhang Zedong's slogan, although it was in life, it came into life before Zhang Zedong already, but this is not important at all. Well, this slogan said, 中学为体，西学为用, or in short, 中体西用, which means we should assume the Chinese as an essence, T, and only apply Western. We should preserve Chinese essence, T, and apply only Western technology, Jung. And Li Zehou has inverted this slogan, and he said, instead of 中体西用, he said 西体中用, which means we should take the Western technology as an essence and only apply Chinese as a function. So, but in fact, Li's view does not differ fundamentally from those thinkers who advocated the appropriation of Western technology and the preservation of Chinese institutions, value systems, and ideologies. In Li's system, the latter, namely the function, Jung, is of immense importance, for it determines the concrete circumstances of people's lives. So, in our attempt to illustrate the similarities and differences existing between modern Confucians and Li Zehou, we shall proceed from his view of modernity and thus focus on this reversal, because it can be considered as paradigmatic. By examining the various treatments of the traditional binary category of essence and function, which underlies these slogans, we can learn much about the different approaches to the modernization of Chinese philosophical reasoning. As mentioned, Ti and Tiong, essence and function, belong to the classical Chinese form of the so-called binary categories. Over the course of the millennial Chinese intellectual tradition, and in its prevailing systems of thought, Ti and Tiong, in the sense of essence and function, were applied primarily in the complementary mode that defines the basic nature of binary categories. So, in order to clarify the differences between Li's reinterpretation of Ti and Tiong, which were based, as we shall see, on Sinicized Marxism, on the one hand, and the complementary relation that traditionally defined these oppositions, this oppositional concept, we shall compare Zehou's understanding of this binary category with that of Xiongshi Li. As I said, as I already mentioned, Xiongshi Li was perhaps the most influential member of the first generation of modern Confucianism, and he was very traditional. So he has also elaborated upon this binary category of substance or essence and function. So his analysis of the T-Jung category, which are based on an upgraded version of the School of Mind approach to binary category, provide a central paradigm for the modern Confucian worldview. So in accordance with the principle of complementarity, we have just seen before that these binary categories are guided by a principle of mutual complementarity. So T and Jung is, of course, not an exception here. So Jung emphasizes in a very traditional way the essential oneness of this bipolar conceptual pair. And he says essence is a term which constitutes itself in the relation with function, but essence is an all-embracing function. It is a manifestation of the totality of all the particularities of function. Hence, we can say that essence is an essence of function, and as such, it can by no means represent an independent entity, which could go beyond function or exist somewhere outside it. The fact that essence is the very essence of function means that it cannot be found outside it. Of course, the same applies also for the function. It also cannot, any function cannot exist without an essence, because it needs an essence to come into life. Something, if function is an application, there must be something which is applied in order that this function can exist. So they are mutually intertwined and interdependent, essence and function, in this traditional view, which was explained by Xiongshi Li. But now let us take a look at Zehou's understanding of the binary opposition of essence and function, because it was slightly different. His inversion, first I would like to say that his inversion of this slogan was generally seen either as a provocation and the expression of radical anti-traditional pro-Western opinion, or as a confused proposition lacking any theoretical foundation. So his revised slogan was immediately attacked and harshly criticized, indicating that he had evidently touched a very sore spot for many contemporary Chinese intellectuals. So in my view, these attacks derived from a misunderstanding, actually. They derive from the fact that, as opposed to Xiongshi Li and other modern Confucians, most 20th century intellectuals, Chinese intellectuals, did not understand this bipolar opposition as a binary category, as described above, but rather in the sense of an either idealistic or materialistic dualism, in which the concept of essence clearly predominated over that of function. Logically, this would mean that in Li's model, China would play a subordinate role with respect to the West. But Li never meant to imply anything of the sort. On the contrary, due to many criticisms he received, he was forced to explain his intentions repeatedly and in various ways. Li's dictum of Shiti Zhongyong is not as anti-traditional as the Chinese authorities have made it out to be. Even in the heady days of the anti-traditional fever of the early 80s, Li never endorsed the fashionable idea of the wholesale Westernization and consistently made a balanced assessment of Confucianism in all his works, for instance, in all three of his famous intellectual histories. So in his most complete elucidation, he begins by defining both oppositional terms, with T defined as body, substance, principle, and Jung as use, function, application. He also points out that the phrase has to be understood within the historical context in which it was first formulated, where it appears as a response both to the neoconservative traditionalist currents as well to the iconoclastic advocates of radical Westernization. In order to demonstrate the mutability of semantic connotations with respect to the different contextual frameworks in which they appear, he summarizes the changing political context of the original slogan. When it was first formulated in the mid-19th century, this slogan was a very progressive expression that was directed against the conservative Confucian government, and only with Zhang Zedong did the slogan assume this neoconservative connotation. While the emphasis of this slogan, 中体西用, was originally on Western function. Let's assume Western technology, let's apply Western technology. While it originally emphasized this need to apply Western technology and know-how, with Zhang, it shifted onto Chinese essence, the importance of the Chinese essence, as a catchword for indicating that the Chinese tradition had to be preserved at all costs. And it was, if we think about it, it is really a bit difficult to only assume or overtake the technology without its theoretical backgrounds. This is somehow a nonsense if we think about it a little bit deeper. So, and this is the meaning against which Li directed his own modified slogan. At the same time, Li was also criticizing the radically pro-Western currents, 全盘西化, that wished to abandon the tradition, which they saw as the main obstacle to Chinese modernization, completely and without appeal. Indeed, at first glance, Li's inversion appears as essentially as a question of terminology. So the main flaw of the slogan Chinese essence and Western applications is found in the assumption that technology is application and not essence. But the exact opposite is true. Technology is essence, because technology is connected with social assistance, as well as with productive forces and the modes of production. This is how Li has explained what he actually thinks about the essence and function. So the correct interpretation of this new slogan hinges on the understanding of the concept T, or essence, which the proponents of the original motto viewed as the essence of tradition, while Li Zehou instead saw it in Marxist terms, namely as a material basis of society. So here we must bear in mind that in Marxism, which is founded on historical materialism, the material base is paramount and absolute. Li tries to accentuate this absoluteness by incorporating many elements of the cultural, psychological structure of the ideologies and ideas and cultural structures into his version of Marxism, into this material base, actually, which he saw, and he saw that as a return to original Marxism, namely to the original historical Marxism, in order to revive the constructive aspects of Marx philosophy. So the ideational cultural and artistic aspects of societies can only be developed on a material technological foundation. And this interpretation of Tea is in accordance with both original Marxism and also original Confucianism. In this regard, Li explains that he understood Western essence primarily as a modernization, which cannot be equated with Westernization, even though modernization doubtless began in the West. I mean, this kind of modernization we are faced with, and which later led to the globalization of our planet, was something that began with the Industrial Revolution in the West. Hence, the concept Jung or function, understood as the ideational superstructure, assumes a crucial significance for Li. Because why? Because it defines the concrete circumstances of individuals in society. So to illustrate this concept, he replaces the traditional terms of essence and function with the more contemporary hardware and software. So because Li Zehou believes that identifying with one's own tradition is a prerequisite for the development of any society or individual, Chinese function, namely the methods of modernization that correspond to specifically Chinese social conditions, is fundamental to the future of the Chinese state, society, and culture. Function is immensely important, for it defines the mode of transition towards a modern society, thus making this tradition more easier and more rational and easier. So therefore, Jung is fundamental to the future of the Chinese state, society, and culture. In this way, Li has tried to synthesize certain elements of Marxism with the Confucian and modern Confucian tradition. This synthesis, however, is built on a different historical, ontological, psychological, and social presumptions than the ones which have, as we have seen, determined the modern Confucian synthesis of Confucius and European, particularly Kantian philosophies. And now let us take a short view upon these four aspects that will serve us as the lens of comparison between modern Confucianism and Li Zehou. So we will now try to clarify these differences through the lens of the four aforementioned aspects: history of Confucianism, ontology, the human self, and individual and society. And let's take a look how they were elaborated by Li Zehou, or what kind of opinion has Li Zehou on these four aspects. First, when we can remember the modern Confucian theory of the Confucian history was based on three phases. Well, Li Zehou distinguishes four periods of Confucianism, and these are the original Confucianism in the preaching period, then the first reform, which happened in the Han Dynasty in the form of very rational cosmology. Then the third phase happens in the Song Dynasty, and the fourth on the edge of the 20th threshold of the 20th century. So the third and the fourth are the same, and the first is also the same. But Li Zehou also sees the Han reform of Confucian thought by Dong Zhongshu as a very, very important phase or period of Confucianism, which was completely neglected by modern Confucians, and he criticizes the modern Confucian philosophy because of this. He writes, for instance, according to Mo Zhongshan and Tu Weiming, the first period was marked exclusively by the works of Confucius and Mencius. But in his view, of course, Xunzi was also equally important. The second period did not start, in their view, before the beginning of the Neo-Confucian discourses of the Song dynasty. And even after that, there was a gaping void of 300 years, which means that they again completely ignored the entire period of the Qing dynasty. According to them, a new developmental stage of Confucianism did not begin before the emergence of Xiong Shili and other pioneers of the modern Confucian movement. He also said that he believes that the formal classification of the theory of three periods scheme contains two big flaws. First flaw is a loss of comprehensive view of this development, because the modern Confucians have interpreted Confucianism through the lens of the moral ethics, of the heart mind, and the inner nature approach. Confucius very rarely mentioned the concept of heart mind and inner nature. They only occur twice in the entire Analects, but the modern Confucianism regarded this heart, mind, and inner nature as very important. Mencius discussed them a bit more, but for him neither was more important than issues pertaining to political philosophy. In the Guodi and Zhu slips, these two notions were mainly treated very concretely and were linked to the concept of emotions, far from being seen as some abstract philosophical ideas. The fact that the theory of three periods placed the abstract moral theory of heart, mind, and inner nature as the very foundation of Confucianism clearly shows that its proponents have ignored or even deviated from the original works of Confucius and Mencius. Secondly, precisely because of this theory simply eliminated Xunzi and even the whole Confucian discourse of the Han Dynasty, together with its main representative, Dong Zhongshu. According to them, the Han Confucius only dealt with the unity of nature and humans, without considering the discourse of heart, mind, and inner nature, and can therefore not be considered as the essence of proper Confucianism. This view is not in concord with the factual history of Confucian thought, Li Zehou says. So here he criticized them that they eliminate, in essence, that they eliminate the second phase of the Han Dynasty and the philosopher Xunzi, because Confucius had two most important followers. One was Xunzi, one of them was Xunzi, and the other one was Mengzi. But the modern Confucian theorists only acknowledge the existence of of Mengzi, and they neglect and deny Xunzi's importance. And Li Zehou thought that this was really scandal. So Li Zehou described, let's go now to the second aspect, and this is the aspect of ontology. He described the worldview that has prevailed in the Chinese tradition as a one worldview, 一个世界观. This view arose from and was developed on the foundation of rationalized shamanism. According to such understanding, there is only one world, namely the world we live in, the world we experience, In this world, the human mind is also formed in accordance with the features and laws of this dynamic and empirical world. There are no transcendent, pre-existing forms of knowledge. There is neither transcendental, pre-existing forms of knowledge. There is neither a need for nor a possibility of transcending into higher intangible realms, and there is also no necessity for a higher force or a personalized God or other deity. In other words, there is no need to establish another separate world of any kind of heavenly kingdom. So this holistic worldview is completely different from the so-called two worldviews which prevailed in the history of Western philosophy and which distinguishes the noumenon from phenomenon, heaven from earth and body from mind. In this context, he also sharply criticized the modern Confucian concept of immanent transcendence, because they have also somehow, although this immanent transcendence was something holistic, like one worldview, but it was still based on this separation between the two realms of existence. So he also, of course, criticized their theoretical foundation, the theoretical foundation of this immanent transcendence, namely the notion of double ontology. So now let's take a look upon how Zehou views the questions, the last two aspects, namely the question of the human self. What is the human self? What is his or her ultimate nature? And how is his or her relationship with the society? Li's philosophy is grounded on the so-called anthropo-historical ontology, which represents his central research method and the elementary paradigm of his general philosophical system, which also denoted the practical philosophy of subjectality. 主体性实践哲学. So why subjectality? Subjectality is actually the duty, and it is the it is derived from the concept of subject, but Zehou wanted to distinguish it from the notion of subjectivity, 主观, which is an epistemological notion. Duty as a subject and subjectality means the ontological view of the human subject, namely the human being as a subject, as an active and autonomous decision-making subject. This kind of subjectality was in the forefront of his view of the human being. But besides this, his view on the human self was also relational. For him, similar to the modern Confucians, he also advocated the Chinese Confucian tradition, which emphasized the important role of family and communities. So every human being for him cannot exist without social context. So in his view, the relation between the individual and society is complementary. And society represents a dynamic network of relations, which means that the human self is relational, and so is society. And this view of the relationship between the relational human self and the relational society is called by Li Zehou Guanxi-主义, which means relationalism or relationism. So now let's conclude with short comparative analysis. I have already mentioned these 4 aspects through which we will look upon these two philosophies. So the first one is the view of the development of Confucianism. As we have seen, modern Confucianism distinguished between 3 phases of Confucian history: Rošker Sanqi, which consist of the original teachings, and then Neo-Confucianism, in which the original Confucian teachings were interpreted through Mengzi, through Mencius, and then the third phase is modern Confucianism. While Li Zehou, if we look to the right half of this slide, Li Zehou has distinguished 4 phases of Confucian history, namely Rošker Siqi. And these 4 phases were original teachings, then the phase that was neglected by the modern Confucians, namely cosmology of the Han Dynasty. The most important philosopher of which was Dong Zhongshu, and in this period, the Confucian teachings were interpreted through the lens of Xunzi's philosophy. And then Neo-Confucianism, in which it was again interpreted through Mengzi, and modern Confucianism. So why is it for Li Zehou? Why does Li Zehou think that this is a very big flaw of modern Confucianism, that it just completely neglected the second phase with Xunzi? Because Xunzi has a somewhat negative reputation, because he is considered to be a bridge between Confucianism and the autocratic legalism. But on the other hand, he has developed the very rational aspects of Confucian teachings, the rational aspects, the logical aspects, and he in Xunzi, we can find a lot of material which can provide us groundwork for developing a Chinese kind of Chinese prototypes of scientific thought. So this rationalism, in Li Zehou's view, this tradition was, the Confucian tradition had rational and idealistic elements, and the modern Confucians have only focused upon this idealism and have completely neglected the rational, the rational aspects of it. So the second aspect, ontology, as we have seen, the modern Confucians have developed the ontology of immanent transcendence, while Li Zehou has developed an ontology of the one worldview. I think that in this sense, the difference between them is not so big, because immanent transcendence, although it is based on a so-called double ontology, which is in which immanence and transcendence are in a complementary relations with one another, it is still a kind of holistic ontology, and in this sense, it is not so very different from the ontology of the one worldview that was developed by Li Zehou. And the last 2 aspects, I think there are not so many differences between modern Confucianism and Li Zehou, because they both philosophies see the human self as relational, is embedded into social context, and this relational self, his behavior, his mode of being, his modus vivendi, is based on the Confucian familism and on the theory of 5 relations. And also, they both somehow emphasize that the relation between individual and society is complementary, and this complementarity is called relationalism by Zehou. So the last 2 aspects are actually very much more or less the same, and also the differences regarding ontology, the second aspects are not that big, but there is a large difference regarding the different classification of the history of Confucian thought, which has, and this difference has pretty far-reaching consequences. But now to conclude, in spite of many differences, Zehou's ethics is not so different from modern Confucian theories. For both of these discourses are permitted with traditional Chinese, particularly Confucian notions or elements. One of the most crucial ones is visible in their common and continuous emphasis on the importance of education. In such a conceptualization, the notion of education is understood in its wider social connotations, but at the same time as an autonomous responsibility of a relational self, who is striving for continuous cultivation. For Li, this is very Confucian, of course. For Li, as well as for all modern Confucians, it is therefore clear that education lies at the root of human existence. Becoming human always means learning to be human. Human becoming, on the other hand, is a never-ending process which people can actively mold and shape. And in this process, all people can also develop or create images, and they can also modify the conditions of their concrete reality in which they live. In this context, we have to understand that humaneness or Renxing, a term which is commonly translated with the problematic notion of human nature. I don't translate it like that. I translate it as humaneness. Humaneness is that which distinguishes us human beings from other animals. And this humaneness is not something self-evident. It is not something which comes to the world together with us. It is not inherent or self-evident. For Li and all the representatives of the modern Confucianism, becoming human is not something that happens without our effort. Becoming human has to be earned. And even more importantly, it has to be learned. So let us learn together. Thank you very much. And now I would like to open the floor for your questions and for our common debate. But thank you first for your patient listening.